And now, Tim Dillon is going to hell with Tim Dillon and Ray Kunk.
Dillon's going to hell, everybody. We have a very special episode today. It's about a year anniversary since we did an episode on the documentary on Netflix, Who Took Johnny. You know, we saw the documentary on Netflix, which is still on Netflix. You can watch it. And we had the director of the documentary in, and we had Johnny's mother in. Johnny, of course, was a paperboy who was kidnapped about 35 years ago today, I think. Or not today, but relatively recently. They had the 35-year anniversary of his disappearance. And the documentary, argues quite persuasively that this wasn't a random kidnapping. It was the work of a group of people that trafficked children across the country and peddled them to wealthy and powerful people. And so we had Noreen Gosh come on, who was Johnny's mother, and we had the director on. And so that documentary led me to a book. And a book, of course, can do what a movie cannot. It lays out a case methodically. And this book, The Franklin Scandal, which I have right here, I'm holding up, written by Nick Bryant, is the culmination of 7 years of research into this topic. It has never before published grand jury documents in it. And I would really suggest that everybody with any interest in this, and even if you don't have interest in this, you will if you pick up this book, buy the book, read it, because no other episode we've done on the show has captured people's imaginations like the one we did a year ago.
It changed the entire course of the show.
Yeah,
and really, there's a certain, I think, frequency it taps into. This whole, when you hear it, it's like it's one of the worst things you can hear. The people don't want to believe it, but on some level, many people understand that this fits into the fabric of the corruption of our country.
Yes, and people come up to me. I perform all over the country. They come up to me. They go, "What's true? What's not?" They don't understand it. I think they're missing it.
Right.
And because this is not a conspiracy theory. It's not a whodunit. It's not really a mystery. Especially if you read the book. That's why I tell everyone, if you're confused at all by the documentary, read the book, because it talks about the larger context.
People get confused because of things like Pizzagate.
Right.
And also, you'll see stuff online, these conspiracies, like, is Taylor Swift part of the Monarch cult?
Right, whatever it is.
Satanic imagery.
Probably shit.
Well, probably is, but you don't have to go,
Right.
That is, the top 5% of, crazy.
Right.
The other 95% is all there. It's all factual. It's all documented.
Yeah. Read and research yourself. And listen, you can choose to believe whatever you want, but if you don't believe this, then you are choosing to ignore mountains of evidence. Nick Bryan, thank you for coming in.
Glad to be on the show.
Yeah, no, thank you for coming in.
When you started covering this, is that when your show went to hell?
Yes, that was right. Before it was just about cooking. And no, but one of the reasons that we go into topics like this, we call the show Tim Dillon's Going to Hell, where basically we go into these types of topics, whether it's financial crime or this, which is, human trafficking. How did you stumble into this as a writer, as a journalist, as your profession? How did you basically go down this rabbit hole?
Well, the Franklin Scandal isn't a rabbit hole that I normally would have gone down. I was looking into an article on the occult. I was going to write an article on the occult, and I came across a U.S. Customs report on the Finders, which was a cult that was seemingly trafficking children and doing very bad things to children, and they were busted by the Tallahassee Police Department, by the U.S. Customs, and by the Metropolitan Police Department, and a search warrant was executed against their warehouses that they had in Washington, D.C., and the people that did the search found like child pornography and all kinds of really weird stuff, and like a telex that said keep the children moving. I mean, so it was obvious.
Like, what is a telex exactly? Like for
a telex that comes across like a screen that told people at that location and other locations to keep the children moving and how to avoid law enforcement. And I mean, I was just stunned by the report. And then the kicker of the report was that the CIA quashed the entire investigation. The last page of the report is, this is becoming a CIA internal matter, and there'll be no more investigation. So the guys that had the 6 children in Tallahassee, the 6 children were put in protective custody. And the 2 guys were arrested on multiple accounts of child abuse. And ultimately, all those charges were dropped, and the children, for the most part, were repatriated with the cult. And I thought to myself, well, how does this happen? I was stunned by that. I mean, first of all, these were pretty seemingly ominous people doing extremely ominous things to children. And then how was the CIA able to quash an investigation? I mean, they don't have any domestic jurisdiction. So, and then the other question I had is, what is the CIA doing with a bunch of people that are in a very strange cult doing very ominous things to children? I mean, so the Franklin scandal is my 7-year investigation to try to understand that. To try to understand that customs report.
And when I didn't mean to interrupt you before, but one of the chilling things when I read about this was like, 'cause at first I wasn't sure what they meant by a telex machine, and you read like, oh, it's like for like basically the implications that they're communicating with people around the world probably to or at least around the country to network to like share these children. Like that's the most chilling. It's not just a warehouse full of kids getting tortured and like, which is bad enough. But the implication that like this is just spreading across the country, across the globe, it's a whole much more sophisticated affair than you would first think.
Well, I mean, and they found a telex message that the cult was purchasing a couple of children in China too. I mean, so these guys were purchasing children, doing bad things with children, seemingly producing child pornography, and then the CIA just comes in and quashes the investigation, and then that's it with the finders.
Yeah, and one of the things recently is that there was a police report that came out through a Freedom of Information request, which I had some time to look at today. And I mean, not only does the police report back up, everything that you've said, but it really talks about the occult angle here, where you have is very weird stuff. Like this is very, it's children slaughtering a goat. It's a goat's head being presented to children. People are naked. I mean, so there are books about mind control that were discovered in the warehouse when they executed the search warrant. So listen, pedophilia is horrible. It's bad. We know, it's all over society, from the Catholic Church to Penn State. But there does seem to be another element here, other than just simply pedophilia. Was that something that you had thought about when you were researching this article on the finders? When you were, did something jump out at you and go, oh, this is especially weird because of these other things besides just the children?
Well, I don't see how someone can read that U.S. Customs report and say that this isn't especially weird. I mean, the whole Customs report is especially weird.
Yeah.
And it just, I had written a number of things on lower socioeconomic children. I'd written a book on lower socioeconomic children. I'd written a number of articles on lower socioeconomic children. I kind of thought I understood what the CIA did and what the CIA didn't. I knew that the CIA was into some ominous things as far as overturning different governments.
Right.
But to have all these things kind of conflate into this was stunning to me. And then the occult angle, too. I hadn't really looked at the occult angle ever before.
Yeah, so, did you have any understanding of...
I did not.
Right.
I did not. I was a complete virgin in all these matters.
After looking into this, and we're going to get into specifics in this book, but just as a general matter, after looking into this and doing the research that you've done, is it your belief that people in positions of power, or just in general, that occult practices are more of a thing than you would have imagined before you started doing this research?
Yes, I think that. Occult practice. There was the Satanic Panic in the early '90s, and it was. It kind of fit in with the late '80s, early '90s. If it bleeds, it leads. The mentality of television, but with this, it was beyond that, and then also with the Satanic Panic. As I looked into that, as I tried to understand that, I came across the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, which was really instrumental in quashing all these bizarre stories. And if one looks at the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, there's definitely another level of weirdness.
Right, because you have kids basically all remembering very similar types of ritualistic abuse. And then you have the False Memory Syndrome Foundation saying that, well, there's this thing called false memories, and that you're actually just maybe convincing yourself that these are actual memories when they were nightmares or something like that. And you think that that foundation is actually potentially sinister.
I do think that that foundation is potentially sinister. And the False Memory Syndrome Foundation was founded by one of the persons that founded it repeatedly molested his daughter.
Right.
And
that's not a that's a very bad.
And that's a bad start.
That's a very bad start.
And another one of the individuals who founded it has been quoted publicly saying that pedophilia is God's will. He's a theologian, so apparently he knows about God's will. So, but then as I dug into the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, I found another level of weirdness, which is people that were affiliated with the False Memory Syndrome Foundation had conducted mind control experiments for the Central Intelligence Agency. Now, here's where it gets kind of interesting, because the False Memory Syndrome Foundation is saying that all these children and adults that have memories of abuse, these abuses are implanted memories by therapists. But when the CIA was called before the Church Commission and they were asked about this, they said they absolutely had no luck at implanting memories in all the mind control experiments that they did over the years. And they did a number of mind control experiments. So someone is obviously lying here.
Right. Well, the irony of it,
either the people at the False Memory Syndrome Foundation are lying, or the CIA is lying.
Right. I mean, the irony of it is that they have documented like Nazi era research into trying to do mind control stuff, which is, of course the CIA has access to, and a lot of people theorize and they've shown evidence that they are and did conduct those experiments. A lot of it dealt with creating trauma to trigger basically these like dissociative personalities. So it's kind of ironic that these people. It's almost like, these guys are experts at, what's a false memory, because they're the ones fucking with the heads.
Well, there was the Extreme Abuse Survey came out. It was published some years ago, and they looked at over 1,000 cases of people that claim to have been victims of mind control and or ritual abuse. And there was a common theme with most of them. There was a ritual abuse, there was dissociation, and I've talked to a number of these people who claim to be victims of government-sponsored mind control, and most of them are multiple personality disorder, dissociative identity disorder, and they discuss various alters being programmed for various tasks, like beta programming is sexual programming, delta programming is assassin programming.
Right.
Yeah, so, but I mean, this isn't coming from one or two or three or four people. This is coming
thousands.
This is coming from lots of people.
Right.
Yeah.
And because that is interesting when you look at the Extreme Abuse Survey and you look at these things. And you read about MK Ultra, which most people don't really know that much about MK Ultra.
Yes. I didn't know that much about MK Ultra.
I didn't know a ton about it. I knew that it happened. I knew that the CIA had it. I think we all kind of know that. They gave some people acid. Somebody jumped out of a window. We all know like the pop culture MK Ultra, but what we don't really know is that there were tons of mind control experiments and experiments with psychotropic drugs done with children.
Well, in the Franklin scandal, I came across some MK Ultra documentation that actually talks about creating dissociative states in children using drugs and electroshock and hypnosis and quote-unquote psychological tricks, whatever quote-unquote. When you've got drugs, hypnosis, and electroshock, and then you've got one kind of shudders to think what psychological tricks may be. But, but they actually talk about doing that, these documents.
Yeah.
So. Now, what do you think? What do you think the end game as far as mind control? Like, do you think it goes as far as like assassination or like? Because there's different theories where like it could be assassination. Some of it's just for sexual use. I mean, do you think it's do you think it's still an act right now? Is my point. Like, do you think they're still kind of
when MK Ultra ended, supposedly?
MK Ultra supposedly ended in the early 70s.
Right.
But a number of purported victims that I've talked to have talked about being manipulated into the 90s.
Right.
So, if they're telling the truth, then these MK Ultra quote-unquote experiments have never really stopped.
it's just to be like these people you talk to? I mean, I imagine when they're discussing that their alters and how they were programmed, do they have to spend like years with therapists to kind of, because they wouldn't know that off the bat, right?
Yes. No. Most people that are multiple personality disorder don't really begin to to understand that until their 40s.
Okay.
There was a Franklin victim that found that he was multiple personality disorder, and I've got a tremendous amount of documentation on him in his early 20s. And but yes, and he speaks fluent German too. So I mean, it makes sense. I mean, if you look at like the MK Ultra documentation, it talks about creating assassins. It talks about being able to create assassins that aren't going to remember what they did. And if they do get caught, they're going to seem so psychologically discombobulated that they can't be taken seriously. So I think that is what is accomplished with this psychological manipulation, with dissociative identity disorder.
And then you program to, like I said, like commit suicide right away, and like kind of.
Yeah, that's also part of it too.
Is it your belief that MK Ultra, and I mean this is because everybody keeps using the word monarch, when
yes.
you go to these message boards and people and a lot of people. So do you think that Monarch it was the continuation of MK Ultra? I mean, you've looked into this more than anybody.
There has never been a document from the CIA or from the government that has had Monarch on it.
Right.
So but a number of these purported victims claim that they are part of the Monarch program.
Right.
So until the government becomes a little more forthright about these issues,
right.
we
won't hold our breath.
At the end of the day, the name's the least important part.
Well, we're probably not going to see a document with Monarch on it,
right.
in the near future,
right.
Unless something pretty radical happens within the government.
And we're going to revisit this. I do want to get into Franklin for a minute because I want to basically to get into your journey, because I know that you went down to Omaha. For people that really don't know anything, and again, buy the book, watch the documentary. This was a child sex ring, essentially.
Yes.
Being operated out of Omaha, Nebraska. The ringleader was a rising star in the Republican Party named Lawrence E. King. He sang the national anthem at, I think it was the 1984 Republican National Convention.
Yes.
He was, man about town. He had very powerful friends in that town and elsewhere in Washington, D.C. And he would travel around the country on private planes with 6 or 8 unnamed passengers that were children. You have these flight manifests.
I do have the manifests. As you said earlier, there was 3 grand juries. This pedophile network was so large that it required 3 grand juries to adequately cover it up. 2 grand juries in Nebraska and 1 grand jury in Washington, D.C. The 2 grand juries, there was a state grand jury and there was a federal grand jury in Nebraska that covered it up. And I acquired the sealed documents and testimony of the state grand jury.
Right.
Which is illegal for me to have and publish, but I did publish it nonetheless.
Right. Now, and now, I believe that the beginning of this started, I think, whether it was the foster care system or somebody was looking into the mistreatment of children or the abuse of children, and then they because there was a commission, and there were.
Well, there in Nebraska there is what's called the Foster Care Review Board.
Right.
And they look at they kind of keep track of the foster care kids. And one of the kids that was in this really bad foster care house, where there were like 7 kids that were just abused physically and sexually, one of them was pandered out to Lawrence E. King, and she was flown to pedophilic orgies in Chicago and also in New York. And
is this Alicia?
No, this is Ulysses Washington.
Okay, right.
And she was eventually, I mean, the amount of abuse that went on in that household is kind of mind-boggling.
Yeah.
And the 2 foster parents perpetrating that abuse, nothing ever really happened to them. But eventually the kids were liberated from that household. And Ulysses told her foster mother, after they developed some trust, that she'd been flown by Lawrence E. King to pedophilic orgies, and that she'd been molested repeatedly by her foster father. And then that report eventually made it to the Foster Care Review Board. Actually, years after the fact, but it eventually made it to the Foster Care Review Board. And then they went to both federal law enforcement and state law enforcement, and they tried to get an investigation into Lawrence and King, but they were just ignored.
Right.
Now, there seems to be a lot of abuse within the foster care system, and it seems like if you were a predator, if you were someone like running a sex ring, it seems like a target that you would want to go to, and there seems to be a lack of control, a lack of proper safeguards to really aggressively And do you think it's just the sheer amount of kids that need to get placed, or do you think there's certain?
No, in this situation there were safeguards, there were checks and balances, but the process had become so unbelievably corrupt because of the power that was involved that had this been just a simple case of child abuse, it would have been stopped relatively quickly.
Right.
But it kept on getting covered up. And then when it went to the Foster Care Review Board, who has a tremendous amount of clout in Nebraska, they thought for sure that they would get an investigation into it. And what happened was they could not get an investigation into it. They were just ignored by state and federal law enforcement. So ultimately, Lawrence King embezzled $40 million from the Franklin Credit Union, which is how the book gets its name, the Franklin Scandal. And a bunch of senators decided to form a committee to look into his embezzlement of this money. And then they got together, and then these foster care review personnel went to the senators and said, Lawrence King's embezzled a bunch of money, but that's not half the story. The part of the big story is that he's been running interstate pedophile network. So at that point, you had Nebraska senators.
Lorraine Schmidt, John DeCamp.
John DeCamp was not a senator at that point,
right.
but he had been a senator, and they started looking into it.
Right.
And they had subpoena powers. So,
right.
And they thought that they would, break it wide open.
Right, and they basically figured there's smoke, there's fire.
Yes.
And at what point was Gary Caradori, who was the investigator, involved? Because I know that he went and tried to pursue photographs to provide evidence of this actually happening, and lost his life.
Well, there was initially an early investigator, and he had a falling out with the Franklin Committee. There was a tremendous amount of pressure put on the Franklin Committee. And eventually, the Franklin Committee hired a private investigator named Gary Caradori, who was an excellent private investigator. He had an exemplary record in the service. He had an exemplary record as a Nebraska State Patrol investigator. And he was an amazing investigator. He had a very large investigative and security firm. And he found other children that were willing to go on record and talk about their abuse, because these children were told, and you see this in with other types of perpetrators. All these children were told, if you talk, we will kill you, we will kill your family.
Yeah.
I mean, so it wasn't easy. I mean, the Foster Care Review Board had some victims that came on board and were willing to talk. But then Gary Caradori found other victims who were willing to talk.
Right. And then Gary Caradori had traveled to obtain evidence, which he supposedly did. And he supposedly...
According to 5 sources,
Right.
Gary Caradori met with one of the blackmail photographers.
Right.
Because this was a blackmail operation.
Right.
First and foremost. I mean, it was a pandering operation, but it was also a blackmail operation.
Right, compromising people in positions with these,
powerful people, yes.
with these kids, and then you own them forever.
Yes, you sold your soul. And Gary Caradori met with Rusty Nelson, who was one of the blackmail photographers. Now, I've got 5 sources that say that Gary Caradori got pictures of these pedophilic orgies from Rusty Nelson in Chicago. And he was flying back to Nebraska from Chicago with his son in the plane. And the plane mysteriously broke up over Lee County, Illinois. And Gary Caradori's pictures were never recovered.
It's so you knowing all that and still investigating this is, that's either insanity or it's bravery. It's something.
Well, it's probably a little bit of both.
Right.
But I had a death threat really early on
Right.
in my investigation of this, and when I realized the first time I went to Nebraska, I was very skeptical of all this. I was very skeptical, and then when I realized it was reality, I was really shaken.
Yeah.
I was really shaken, and then the death threat kind of sanctified that this was a reality. And
Well, you had, when you went to Nebraska, and I believe you met with the photographer.
yes, I did.
And the same photographer that Gary Caradori met with.
Yes.
So you're talking about doubling down.
And he told, he said something kind of interesting to me. He said, it's like you're on a yacht. Once you're compromised, it's like you're on a yacht.
Right.
And it's a beautiful day, and you're on this yacht, and it's a beautiful yacht, and you can have anything you want. You're on this yacht, and anything that you want is provided to you. But if you decide to get off the yacht, the people on the yacht will make sure that you drown. So that's why you don't see too many people getting off the yacht.
Right. And you were stopped by the police, and your car was, I believe, searched.
Well, I was Rusty Nelson, who isn't the paragon of veracity. I got to admit, Rusty has some issues telling the truth, but
you do believe he was photographing these sessions?
No. Well, I've got other people that have corroborated that.
Right.
So
okay.
I've got.
Right.
I wouldn't take anything that Rusty said to me on face value,
right.
Because he is a child pornographer,
right?
And which means that he's somewhat sociopathic,
right?
If not completely sociopathic,
right?
And it's probably no way of you knowing, but many abusers were abused as children. Do you think a lot of people were involved, like guys like Rusty and people like handlers, or also
Lawrence E. King? Do you think they potentially, not that it would excuse what they're doing?
Of course not.
Do you think they were potentially abused?
I don't know. I looked into King's background.
Yeah.
I've actually spent a night with Rusty's parents.
Okay.
Wow.
This is above and beyond.
They came across. It didn't see. I think a lot of these guys. I think with King there was just a pathology. He was in Southeast Asia,
right?
And he had top security clearance. He was in the Air Force.
Vietnam.
He was in Thailand.
Okay.
And I think that he might have been. I'm not 100% on this, but I think that he might have been turned at that point.
Right.
Rusty Nelson wanted to be a photographer, and this was his ticket to being a photographer. So that's how those two came together.
And you met with him, and then the cops pull you over.
Well, actually, Rusty led me on kind of. I wanted to get.
Photographs.
I could not. Everybody in New York was unwilling to touch this story, and I thought, well, if I get photographs of this, I mean, how can they ignore it?
Right.
So Rusty took me on a wild goose chase to get photographs, and I did not get them. But when I was driving Rusty home on this thoroughfare, I was going 70 in a 65. I got pulled over, and I got taken out of my car immediately. Rusty got taken out of the car, and then my rental car was completely ripped apart.
Now, so if you did have those photographs, you would be in jail.
I made a video before I went out there,
Okay.
and I said what I was. I was very cautious about this investigation. Every time that I would go for something, I'd make a video, and I'd say, "This is what I'm going to do."
Right.
And this is what if this happens or that happens, this is because.
Right.
Because if X happens, it's because of Y.
Right.
So I was protected in that sense, but had I had those pictures, it would have gotten pretty ugly, I think.
Yeah.
Now, is there an average age to the children that were being abused in this whole system?
Yeah, because this is not like somebody who's 17 dating somebody who's 28. That's not this situation.
No,
really.
no.
This is like young kids.
The youngest I talked to was 9 or 10, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
But I mean, the kids with the finders were 3.
yeah, the kid. Well, actually, some of them were 2.
Right. Jeez.
So, but yeah, with the youngest one. And there could have been younger ones involved
Right.
in the Franklin scandal, but the youngest one I talked to was like 8 or 9.
But we talk about these like pedophilic orgies. A lot of them like teenagers, like 13, 14. Is that like, or is it mostly like?
What we're trying to get at is is there something biological? There's something biological about pedophilia being attracted to kids who are prepubescent. There's something biological about that orientation, because we would discuss this and we understand, like, if you get a hooker that's 16, why not just, I hate to sound crass, why not get an 18-year-old hooker? Like, why go, like, what is the...
Right, because at the end of the day, like, it's a pathology. It's something inside you. Like, you're a monster because you're molesting a 6-year-old. Of course, you're a monster for a 12-year-old. But like, there's such a massive shift. But like, there doesn't seem to be that much. Is it more of a psychological pathology, like with that? Because like, biologically, there's not much difference between a 16 and 18-year-old a lot of the time.
Well, psychologists and psychiatrists have been trying to answer that question for a long time.
Right.
Is it nurture? Is it nature?
Right.
Sometimes it's both.
Yeah.
I think that some people that were involved in this were molested and others weren't.
Right.
I talked to it because I really had a hard time with this.
Yeah.
Trying to understand it. And I talked to a psychologist in Washington, D.C. who works with these type of perps, powerful perps that actually want to do something about it.
Yeah.
Go straight to
And she said to me, a lot of times it's this forbidden fruit element, because you're talking about guys that are very powerful and very wealthy, and they can have $1,500 an hour prostitutes. They can have 20 at a time.
Right.
But they ultimately stray for forbidden fruit. Now, some of that is probably nurture, some of that's nature, and maybe some of that's, I talk about it at the end of the book. Maybe some of that is just part of the pathology of power.
Right, because they do seem to be overrepresented in power positions.
I don't know. It's hard to say. There's a lot of studies. Up to 17% of girls are abused in their households by a relative.
Yeah.
In Western society. But then when you extrapolate that out and you factor in priests and teachers and coaches and things like that, you end up with a fairly significant number of people in the society that have been sexually abused.
And not to hammer the whole they're 16 idea too much, but one other thing that I was thinking about was, like, of course, a lot of these guys who were being blackmailed were molesting these children willingly, maybe all of them. But I was wondering, if some of them, if they have like a 16-year-old who looks a little older, they have like a party with these senators, and do you think there's any people who were like ensnared into a blackmail thing unwillingly?
Unknowingly.
Well, I get into that in the book, and also I wrote a follow-up book called Confessions of a D.C. Madam.
Right.
And Lawrence E. King, who trafficked these children out of Omaha, had a partner in Washington, D.C. named Craig Spence.
Right.
And Craig Spence had a house in Washington, D.C. that was wired for audiovisual blackmail. And the second book I wrote on this was Confessions of a DC Madam, and that was about Henry Vincent, who ran an escort service, a gay escort service, and Craig spent up to $20,000 a month on escorts in $1980 or $1990. So, but what happened there was, and I think that the pedophilia was introduced there too. What would happen there was it would just be like a regular cocktail party.
Right.
Washington, D.C., there would be a bunch of power brokers there. I mean, I talk about all the powerful people. I mean, who's who ended up at Craig Spence's house. And like at 10 o'clock, I mean, and people would be lubricated on alcohol, and at like 10 o'clock, maybe 10:30, 11 o'clock, someone would fire up a joint, break out a line of coke, or something sexually promiscuous would happen, and the people that weren't attracted to that would leave, but the people that wanted to stay, I mean, they were compromised.
Right.
So that's how that worked.
After Gary Caradori, who was the investigator, after his plane blew up, does that dissuade other people? Now, I would imagine. Now, I mean, what happens in the case at that point? Does the case go cold?
Yeah, well, when Gary Caradori died, there's a Chinese proverb that says, "Kill one man, silence 1,000."
Right.
And in this case, kill one man and his son, and silence, untold thousands. So what happened there was, okay, so you had a state grand jury and a federal grand jury say that there was absolutely no child abuse. You had Gary Caradori getting very publicly assassinated. And the people that were pushing for an investigation realized that if these guys are willing to kill Gary Caradori,
They're willing to kill me.
there's nothing that we can do.
Right.
So that's how it happened. And then there was a juggernaut of the U.S. Department of Justice, Douglas County, which is where Omaha is. I mean, their grand jury said that there was no child abuse. And the two kids that refused to recant their abuse were indicted for perjury on perjury charges.
Yeah, and you tell the very inspiring story in this book of somebody named Alicia Owen, who's an incredibly strong, heroic figure, who did not recount and went into. She was guilty. She was found guilty of perjury, and in a kangaroo court. I mean, you really talk about that, and you go into it in this book. And to do that to a child, I mean, this is evil. This is all evil beyond human comprehension.
Yes.
I mean,
the whole thing.
The whole thing is evil.
Yes.
But this particular part of it, after she had suffered all this abuse, to then lock her up, and then she did how long in solitary confinement?
She was in solitary for nearly 2 years.
2 years in solitary confinement.
Did they even do any, the DA, or did they do anything to attempt to explain what her motive would be in this situation?
Her motive, according to the story, she wanted to be famous.
Oh,
that's why she came forward.
This country is so fucked.
And you know, it's funny. I'm the only person she's ever given an on-record interview to, and it took me 4 years of cultivating her to get that interview. So
that doesn't sound like a Kardashian.
No,
you know what I mean?
She's definitely not a Kardashian.
Yeah.
And does she talk about the similar things we talked about before with the different altars, or like is it the ritual?
No,
stuff?
Alicia was conscripted or baited when she was about 14, so she wasn't abused when she was really young. She's not dissociative. She does not have dissociative identity.
Right. How much, going back to the mind control element of it, because it is so fascinating because there's so little known about it. Mm-hmm. Is it your belief now that you've kind of looked at this, that if you are, who in the CIA is doing this? I would imagine this is not like the director. I would imagine, these are black ops, meaning ops that nobody will admit are happening. And are these people that are working at are these people that are assets of the agency where they're not like officially on the books?
Or even American, or there's a CIA black site with the whole
I mean, what is the mechanics of this, or I mean, how much do you know about the mechanics of this?
Well, I mean, when the CIA was on the record conducting its mind control experiments, many major universities were taking part in these, regardless of how sadistic, and many of these experiments were extremely sadistic. So you had a number of people taking part in these experiments, and like Ewan Cameron in Canada, who was head of the American Psychiatric Association. He was head of the World Psychiatric Association, and he was conducting some of the most sadistic mind control experiments that one could imagine. He would bring people, women would come into his clinic, a lot of times with postpartum depression, and he would completely erase their hard drive with drugs and electroshock. He would bring them through 3 states. The first state was, do you know who you are and do you know where you're at? And then they would know who they are and know where they're at. The second state is they would not know who they were or where they were at, but they would feel anxiety about it. And then the third state was they would not know who they were or where they were at, but they would feel no anxiety about it.
Right.
So he was completely wiping their hard drives completely clean, and the CIA paid him to do this. I mean, he was being paid by the CIA.
And when he
the
did
CIA
that,
was underwriting it.
when he did that, was like, is this stuff that to the public? There's a kind of like a pseudo-scientific like framework for like, oh, here's what my clinic does, just to like, deflect from the whole idea of it.
No, it was under the auspices of a highly exalted psychiatrist. As I said earlier, he was head of the American Psychiatric Association, head of the World Psychiatric Association. He was there to help people with psychiatric problems.
Right.
And where he ran into problems is one of the members of the Canadian Parliament brought his wife there because she had postpartum depression. And he picked her up, and she didn't know who he was. And he initiated a lawsuit against the CIA that waited for years. I mean, the CIA just completely got the judicial process bogged down, and ultimately it became a class action lawsuit against the CIA, and each plaintiff got like about $100,000.
Yeah, you would think they'd be smarter than that, than to just, that you think they'd pick their victims with a little bit more care.
But that's the arrogance.
Yeah.
Right.
That's the arrogance involved here.
Now, the scope of it. Here's what's so troubling to a lot of people is that we don't understand pedophiles. They disgusting. But people who are in a more bureaucratic sense implementing these systems of abuse and control of children is the shocking thing. Do you think that they recruit within the agency people who are more? Is it more like they condition their people to be able to do this, or they recruit certain kinds of people?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both, probably.
And do you think they're working with these cults just knowing that these occult practices, in many cases, often victimize innocent children? And
well, there is a segment of the occult fraternity that their highest sacrament is the defilement of innocence.
Right.
And these would, if you were going to have people abuse children and dissociate them, I mean, they would be the perfect people. So,
how widespread is Satanism in something like the United States military?
I don't know. I don't know if this is still the case, but the Church of Satan and the Temple of Set were in the Army Chaplain's Handbook of Valid Religions. So there's different, I've heard different anecdotal evidence about, very high people, high-ranking people in the military being Satanists.
Right.
But the military hasn't been forthcoming about those numbers for the obvious reasons. So it's one of those things where you can just, it basically comes down to a surmise or an extrapolation.
And my question is because there was a huge, actually, in San Francisco, there was a huge scandal, regarding the abuse of very young children at an Army base, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, San Presidio or...
Presidio.
Yeah, San Presidio military base, which of course everybody found that I think people were exonerated there, pretty much.
One wasn't, but 2 were.
Okay, right.
And a number of the children had chlamydia.
Yes.
Which is a venereal disease.
And now we're talking 4-year-olds.
Yes, we're talking very young. Right. And one of the children, and I have the search warrant that the San Francisco Police Department executed against Colonel Michael Aquino, who is an admitted Satanist.
Right.
Well, he would call himself a Setian, I think.
Right.
temple set.
He's on message boards calling himself everything. I mean, he's talk about accessible.
But
that guy is.
But the child picked Aquino's house out, and the child also described things in Aquino's living room and also his bathroom. But the charges were dropped against Michael Aquino and his wife.
Now, when you look at the entirety of the idea of Satanism, because there is something in like American history when you look like back to the founding of the country, and we're coming out of the Enlightenment, so like the Masons kind of, you know, almost, well, and perhaps as a cloak or whatever, but you know, but this idea that like, yeah, they rejected these anti-Christian symbols were kind of a symbol of like freedom from the church and all that kind of stuff. Do you think that like there is with Satanism an overall population who are people who are, you know, more establishment and free thinking, or do you think there is, for the most part, a sinister, like the totality of the religion tends to be people who want to, you know, do sinister things?
Well, I've talked to a number of occultists over the years, and some of them are in it for an aesthetic. Some of them have turned their back on the Judeo-Christianity. But some of them have talked about that there is a very dark side of the occult, a very dark side, where these practices take place. And according to victims in the Franklin scandal, a bunch of them did come forward and say that they had been abused in an occult setting.
We always hear these things are like fraternities. This is kind of I think the de facto answer is like everybody's blowing off steam. You got a bunch of people with hoods on in Monterey, California, and there's a mock sacrifice, and they're burning something in effigy, and it's a fun club, and the Skull and Bones Society is like people, you know, waking up in graves, but it's like it's like a big Halloween party. Where do you come down on that? Is it possible that that's what some of it is, or do you think there is something kind of darker and more sinister to this imagery that's constant occult imagery with these very elite, wealthy, well-connected people? I think it's both.
Yeah, I think that there's an exoteric side to it, and I think that there's an esoteric side to it. The exoteric side is like art, and there have been a number of artists that have used occult symbols in their paintings, and then you have Bohemian Grove, the cremation of care ritual that you were referring to, and so that is like an exoteric side.
Yeah.
But I think that there's a very dark esoteric side to it too.
Right.
And I don't remember if you made this point in your book or with someone else, but one interesting idea was the idea, like, yeah, perhaps some of it is, you know, if a child's being abused with someone like wearing a ritual goat head or an actual goat's head, so, and this kind of imagery is going on, it'll make their stories harder to believe if they come out and try to talk about it. It makes them discredited.
Yes, I mean, it's very difficult for children that have been this traumatized to be taken seriously. Because their stories. I mean, the Franklin scandal, the Finders. I mean, even Jeffrey Epstein, which we've talked about before.
Sure.
I mean, that stuff is so out there that most Americans would have a hard time taking it seriously. But there's so much evidence for it. I mean, there's so much evidence. For that the Finders were doing very bad things. You know, the Franklin scandal, there's a tremendous amount of evidence for that. And there's a tremendous amount of evidence for ritual abuse. Tremendous amount of evidence.
And it also makes a tremendous amount of sense because we see pedophiles getting caught all the time, you know, like regular people who go to, you know, jail and caught abusing their children. And like there's no doubt, just looking at demographics, that, you know, a certain percentage of wealthy elite people will also have his predilections. But why, you know, but they don't necessarily have to, you know, go out and get people themselves. They'll be serviced by some kind of network, most likely.
Well, the difference between a powerful pedophile and a poor pedophile is poor pedophiles go to prison, and wealthy pedophiles generally don't.
It's like that book, Rich Dad, Poor Pedophile, Poor Pedophile.
Yes.
Like the follow-up.
It's,
hasn't been written yet.
It's kind of interesting. There was, within the last couple of years, a number of people that were affiliated with National Security Agency were
Right.
caught with downloading child pornography, and a very small percentage of them actually went to prison. I mean, which is kind of mind-boggling.
Yeah, it not only is it mind-boggling. Now talk about and I'm sure you do know something about this. What element does the dark web add? Now you have this completely, free, unregulated part of the internet that you can trade in these horrible photos, videos, things like that. Has that made the business of human trafficking bigger? Has it made the ability of these networks to operate more seamless? How have you? Because I know that you look into the issue, or is it something you don't?
Well, I mean, it's pretty. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that pornography is much more accessible now.
Right.
With the internet.
Yeah.
And child pornography is probably much more accessible too.
Yeah, because in the book we're talking crazy stuff. We're talking snuff films.
Yes.
We're talking kids being murdered on camera. We're talking about, that's one of the reasons in your follow-up book, Henry Vincent, I think, was the DC Madam. I think he was like, Larry King's asking him, can you procure children who can disappear because people want to do horrible things to them? And Henry's like, whoa, slow,
Yes.
Wait a minute, I'm a pimp, but geez, you know what I mean? That was my question, kind of about the dark web. Is it you have this avenue now to put this stuff out? Are these stuff films? Is that stuff that you think there's some credibility there, where you're there is some horrible stuff out there?
Well, if you look at what happened in the UK, and what's happening there now, that pedophile network went all the way up to the Prime Minister, Ted Heath.
Right.
I mean, he was part of the pedophile information exchange.
Right.
And he never married.
Yeah.
And so he was being provided with children. I mean, there's some evidence of that. And then Margaret Thatcher played an instrumental role in covering that up.
Right.
But a number of investigators have come out and said that, these guys were killing kids. I mean, these investigators in the UK have said that these guys were actually killing kids. And there's accounts of that. From some of these victims.
And what you've kind of talked about is that you put this in a historical context. This type of sexual sadism and violence towards children goes back so far.
Very, very far. I mean, in the Western annals, Tiberius was fond of molesting kids and killing them.
Right.
Little boys. So, this isn't something that's just started to occur because of television.
Right.
I mean, goes back.
It is amazing, though, how it's been able to have been covered up. This is what shocks everybody. The levers of power that are able to when you tried to publish this book, what happened?
Well, here's the thing. The media is spineless.
Here we are.
And spineless. And so I wrote an article, and I whittled that book down to an article, and with the barest of facts, and I gave it to just about every major magazine in the country, certainly in New York, and no one would touch it. And I thought to myself, well, it's kind of a big story, and I whittled it down to an article, because I like to give people the benefit of the doubt.
Sure.
So I wrote a very long book proposal, and I gave it to my agent, and my agent said, about 2 weeks later, said that she was no longer representing me. And then...
Did she give you a reason? I hate to laugh. We don't mean to laugh.
No,
but
she said I had problems constructing a proper narrative. So, that was the reason she gave me. So I got another agent who was a very good agent, not as good as the other one, who said I wasn't constructing a proper narrative. But, but he's a very good agent, and he couldn't sell it.
Right.
Now, so I've taken it further. Now I've got... it's been optioned by Magnolia Pictures, and I've got some big guns in Hollywood that are trying to sell a documentary series like The Keepers.
Wow.
And every network that we pitched it to. I mean, and these guys you would know some of these guys.
Yeah.
I mean, one's an icon.
Right.
We've been shut down by everybody.
Yeah.
Everybody. So it's really a sad commentary on our media that children can be molested with impunity. And the media will not do anything. I personally have given the Franklin scandal to 3 of Oprah's producers, one of Nancy Grace's producers. They never got back to me. I mean, in the sense that they just said that they weren't going to do anything with the story. So you have people that are supposedly child advocates that are unwilling to touch this, and and granted, it's a sensational story, and it's a hairy story, and it's a horrible story. But ultimately, what we're talking about is scores of children that were molested with impunity.
Right.
And you would think that there would be a moral barometer in someone in the media.
Yeah.
Well, what's interesting about it is that if this was the 1980s or the early 90s, it'd be one thing. But this is after the church sex scandals have come out, which the Boston Globe covered, and tons of papers covered. The media, and eventually, first they rejected it, eventually embraced it. So you would think that there would be an impetus now. Now that we know this is capable in a large organization, so it makes you wonder, how much of this is being
Killed. How much
Right.
is this being killed?
Well, I do know. I was pitching it in Hollywood about 5 years ago, and there was a vice president of a studio that wanted to do something with it, and he started getting kind of ominous phone calls.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I think that most of it is. I don't think that a lot of threats have to be dispensed. I just think that most of it is just spinelessness.
I mean, have you heard of Nancy Schaefer?
Yes.
Okay, so she was, somebody who did a lot of work, kind of exposing the many dangers to children in the foster care system and the child protective services. Her and her husband are murder-suicide. Is that something that when you look at it, you're intensely suspicious of because of the work she did and knowing what you know?
Yeah, I know about that. I haven't looked into it.
Sure.
The way that I like to look into things.
Yeah.
Because,
Before comment, of course.
So I don't really want to come. But, I know what's happened to me.
Right.
And I've had a lot of heat put on me.
Yeah.
And my, when I realized that was a reality, I concluded that I was going to do this.
Yeah.
And that the only way that I was not going to do it is if I was murdered.
Right.
I was willing to give my life to this. And
Do you think this story is so powerful because it potentially unravels so much else? So much blackmail, so much corruption, so many sinister things, so many sociopaths in power, that it would just be the beginning of the avalanche? Do you think that there's a real potential that this would open up some, things that are, equally heinous and, potentially?
Well, here's what we know about. Political blackmail has been with us forever.
Right.
J. Edgar Hoover
Right.
was a practitioner, and he was probably blackmailed himself. The head of counterintelligence for the CIA, James Angleton.
Yeah.
Also a practitioner of blackmail. The CIA's been a practitioner of blackmail forever.
Yeah.
So, but we think that they're blackmailing people in other countries.
Right.
But why would I just find it mind-boggling. Chances, according to John Fitzgerald Kennedy's secretary, Evelyn Lincoln, J. Edgar Hoover blackmailed John Kennedy to get Lyndon Johnson on the ticket. So, if that's true, and she's a woman that has a tremendous amount of credibility.
Right.
If that's true, that completely altered the trajectory of history. And it is known that Kennedy did not want Johnson on that ticket.
Right.
So that is something that is, Dennis Hastert.
Right.
pedophile for many years, dating back to his days as a teacher in Chicago. And he was the Speaker of the House for 7 years.
Right.
He was constitutionally the third most powerful man in the country. And according to Sibel Edmonds, in a deposition, the FBI and probably the Turkish authorities knew what he was up to.
Right.
So, and then there's just so many other examples of that.
Now, that Pizzagate story that came out, which I remember I talked to you when it broke, and you said you're very skeptical of it because they were kind of regurgitating some of these, frankly, talking points that were incorrect, things that were not true. But when you do look at that story, you do see that Denny Hastert being very good friends with John Podesta's brother,
Yes.
Tony Podesta, who's the biggest lobbyist, most powerful lobbyist in Washington, and they're traveling all over around the world together. I mean, that's odd that you have your friend who you're traveling all over the world with and having no clue about his, and also just being the most powerful lobbyist in Washington. Wouldn't you be in the know about some of these things? Would you, if you had to pontificate?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of unanswered questions there. And, I mean, there's a lot of things that lead to places. I spent a little time with it, but I wasn't able to corroborate things that I wanted to corroborate.
Right.
So, at this point, I don't really like to comment on it because I just haven't sufficiently corroborated things that I wanted to corroborate.
Right. And you and again, 7 years. This book is not. You didn't do this on a whim. You know.
It's when you bring allegations like this to the fore, you have to really be cautious about, especially what I'm saying here. What I'm saying in the Franklin scandal is that the FBI and the Department of Justice cover up child trafficking, and that there's probably an endemic blankmail system that that is at play in our political system. So allegations like that are just so treacherous, and so malignant that I just felt like I had to really corroborate.
Do you ever sit back and you hear all these people complaining about Trump and listen, you know, Trump sucks or whatever, but do you ever sit back and you're like, you guys really don't know that half of it? Like when people start talking about how bad things are you ever like a dinner party or you're out to dinner and somebody says something about, I can't believe he would, you know, rescind Obamacare, and you're like, oh, well, you don't, you know? Is it hard for you to have regular political discussions because knowing the things you know?
Yes, I mean, when people talk to me about politics, I very seldom get into what I know and what because it's for the most part incomprehensible to them.
Right.
I mean, they're being fed media by the mainstream media, and the mainstream media isn't touching this type of subject matter. Because it can't. Because I think that people in the media are heavily compromised also.
Right.
So, and I think that there's a synergy between the government and the media. And, I mean, these titanic media conglomerates.
Yeah, there's 5 of them now.
That
control literally all the information.
That exist today. I mean, the government could break them up with antitrust legislation in a heartbeat.
And they're not particularly profitable. So the idea is, why would they want to own them except to shape the narrative out there?
Well, here's the thing. The government can break these conglomerates up in a heartbeat. So why would these conglomerates, you know, want to piss the government off?
Right.
Because, I mean, there's obviously a symbiosis there.
Is there any good people? Is there any white knights? I mean, Jane Mayer wrote the book The Dark Side about torture, and she talks about like these, you know, we had one of them on our show, John Kiriakou. We have these people that are like whistleblowers that are like, listen, we shouldn't be doing this. The country shouldn't be doing this. Are there any of those people in these agencies, or are they silenced, or are they just not aware of what's going on? Or
well, I talk about it in the Franklin scandal. A couple of feds helped me out with and provide me with some information.
Right.
But I had to cultivate their trust for 2 years.
Right.
Because they knew if any of that information that they provided me got out and they were the source, I mean,
they go to jail.
In the very least, they would lose their jobs.
Right.
So they were very cautious with me. And like I said, it took me 2 years to cultivate their trust. But there were 2 people in federal law enforcement that came forward that provided me with some pretty amazing information.
John DeCamp, who's the Nebraska legislator, who spearheaded this, and you met him, and he died recently.
Yeah.
A really heroic figure, and an advocate on behalf of children. His mentor, the name escapes me, but
William Colby.
William Colby, CIA guy. Was Colby ever the director, or?
Yeah, he was the director.
He was the director of the CIA. He died very suspiciously.
Yes, I talk about it in the book.
And you talk about this in the book in a canoeing guy. Is it possible that William Colby was one of the good guys who basically, this stuff kind of came to light and he was like going to try to do something about it? Is that possible?
Well, Colby had a interesting history. He was involved in some incredible malfeasance with the Phoenix program.
Right.
And also basically manipulation of the Italian election when the communists were poised to take control of the government in the 60s. And but he also during the church hearings, there were 2 CIA directors, and he was the one that talked about the assassination programs, the mind control programs, and various things. And then he was immediately fired by Gerald Ford, and George Herbert Walker Bush replaced him as director. Now,
honest guy.
and so now, and he did give an interview to Conspiracy of Silence, the documentary, and I talk about it in my book. He told, so he was hired by the Senate, the Senate subcommittee in Nebraska to find out who killed Caradori. Now, he wasn't willing to state publicly that Caradori had been murdered, but he told a number of people privately that Caradori had been murdered. And he had also, from what I understand, refound Catholicism.
Right.
Catholicism had become a bigger part in his life. And according to John DeCamp, he was cool with everything he'd done in the CIA, except for the abuse of children.
Right.
That was one thing that he just couldn't have a emotional stasis with.
And to be clear, was the camp saying that he relayed to him that he was involved in this?
Yes, DeCamp. He and DeCamp told me that they had this conversation in Washington D.C. and that Colby was going to do something about that, and then he had a very mysterious death. And Colby's son made a documentary about it and said that his father had committed suicide, and Colby either committed suicide or he was murdered.
Do you think Colby was directly involved in things he regretted with the kids, or no? Like, is that...
Well, he oversaw this. He was the director of the CIA. So, and he had been in intelligence since the OSS.
So he knew the deal.
He must have known.
That famous James Angleton quote, the head spy, spy master, head spy, whatever. When he said when the CIA was formed, he said he was kind of, I'm paraphrasing, but he said, "I'm sitting in a room with people that I know will surely end up in hell." This is what James Angleton was dying. It's in the book The Devil's Chessboard by David Talbot. This Angleton was like, when the CIA was formed, you're sitting in a room with people. He goes, I'm sure we'll end up in hell. And then he took a drink. He goes, and I'll join them there shortly. So these were people that were, they had made their peace with doing some very nefarious things.
Well, they were going up against, and it was a different time. You had Joseph Stalin was alive, and Joseph Stalin had the atomic bomb, and then he had the hydrogen bomb.
Right.
So it was a different time, and the ends justified the means.
Alan Dulles also got a lot of Nazis out of Germany for not even to build a rocket.
They did do some things.
They did a lot of nefarious things. Yeah. Operation Paperclip, what you're talking about, is the getting Nazis out of Germany, and but they did a myriad of things.
But in their mind, these were all patriotic things to do. As crazy as that may sound.
Well, you get to a point. Where when you lose your moral barometer, when the ends justify the means, where you can rationalize anything.
Right. Whereas a guy like Bill Casey didn't seem too concerned with these problems.
Bill Casey didn't seem to have a problem with his conscience.
Right.
Whereas William Comey did.
Right. Okay.
Now, we know the CIA is in a large way a nexus of business and these investment banks. I mean, most of the CIA, original founding guys came out of investment banking, or a lot of them did. Do you think that kind of follows through? Like, is there indication that there's like high level, with these high level banks, investment banks, with like prominent wealthy people, not just in the sense of like wealthy guys, but like on a more commercial sense, any connection with these rings, or
Is there a lot of dark money being pumped through government projects? Because I would imagine that this human trafficking is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Is that something you've looked at, the trail of money at all, or is that kind of difficult to kind of analyze?
Yeah, the money is really tough.
Yeah.
Follow the money is like impossible. With the Franklin scandal, you're able to follow the money to a certain degree because I acquired all those sealed grand jury documents.
Yeah.
But when you're just looking at, pornography and the dark web, it's impossible to find.
Right.
I mean, given the information that I have.
What can people do? And I mean, we always kind of, as
the answer is always nothing.
Right. Well, as we're wrapping up these interviews, we ask Russ Baker, we ask David Talbot, we ask you, we ask guys, and I consider the work you've done heroic, legitimately, because you've put yourself at personal and professional risk, and I think that Russ has, and a lot of people that write about things have. You maybe more so than anyone else, because I mean, everyone that's gotten near this thing is dead. It's not everyone, but enough people for you to go, hey, let's write about something else. What do you tell people? Because not everyone is going to write a book. Not everyone's going to. I think everyone should buy this book, read this book, educate themselves. But if the deck is so stacked, what can people do? I mean, it's just. Do you have any?
Well, this is a disease.
Yeah.
In the society.
Yeah.
It's a disease, and the only way that you can attempt to rid a disease from the body is you have to diagnose it, and you need awareness. So people have to become aware. It's up to them. It's incumbent upon them to become aware. And there's books like the Franklin Scandal out there where people can be aware, can become aware. And once you have that awareness, then you can go after the disease.
Yeah.
But if you don't have the awareness, most Americans, the vast majority of Americans, are not aware of what the information that's in this book. Because I had to get this book, unfortunately, was published by a very small publisher that did not have a lot of money. And I had to do a lot of podcasts. I've been on television once for this book. And so the mainstream media has been really reluctant to help me out at all in publicizing that book. But I think it's incumbent upon, you've got listeners.
Yeah.
They can read this book. They can start expanding their consciousness and becoming aware. And once there's a critical mass of awareness,
that's when things change.
Then something can be done.
Yeah.
Now, one thing that happens with a lot of these topics that are not covered by the mainstream media is that, like, a lot of times the information will be co-opted by things that are more like just salacious conspiracy theory kind of sites, and or just guys like Alex Jones and these kind of more sensational things.
Who's right about certain things.
Oh, sure.
But
That's
Well, the thing is, conspiracy theory is in 1967. The CIA had a memo, and there were a lot of people that Mark Lane and Lloyd Garrison were getting a tremendous amount of traction in the mainstream media. They were getting interviewed by Johnny Carson, by Dick Cavett. They were in the mainstream media, and the vast majority of Americans by 1967 did not believe the Warren Commission. So the CIA sent out a memo, and it said, we have to position these people as quote-unquote conspiracy theorists. And it's a 1967 memo. So basically, and then at that point, you see the New York Times and the Washington Post, the use of the term conspiracy theory rises exponentially. So the CIA weaponized that term, conspiracy theory.
Do you think to a certain extent that they also put people out into the field who are kind of putting less cogent ideas out there?
Do you think the disinformation?
Well, absolutely. I mean, Operation Mockingbird is the CIA's plan to basically usurp the media. And a number of things have been written about it. A really great book called Catherine the Great was written by a Village Voice journalist. And Carl Bernstein wrote a very good article in Rolling Stone in 1977. There's been a number of articles and books written that do talk about how the CIA has infiltrated the media. So yes, there are disinformation agents that are out there that are part of the mainstream media.
Now, and part of that is like, when you look at these, I mentioned it earlier in the show, like these conspiracy theories, and there's one like I saw recently someone shared on Facebook. It was like, it's this new Taylor Swift video, basically telegraphing these different like alters of her, because she's a beta sex kid, whatever I'm not sure the exact terminology they use.
Mm-hmm.
And there is,
I'm sure it's not beta sex.
No, they
kitten.
use sex kitten in the
Is
thing.
that true?
There's a thing
Right.
there.
I'm sorry, I've never.
I don't know how much you've like researched any of that or like looked into it, but like, do you give any credence to that? Like, there's a lot of.
Does any of that make any sense to you? Like when they're like Lady Gaga's in the Illuminati, it's like, and here's her video, and they are weird. Some of these videos are strange. Where you're like, why is she?
Well, because also these sites have like they'll show you like Disney films or like tons of Hollywood films where they'll show you like this is satanic imagery and it's kind of being like laid into mainstream media. Do you think there's anything to that?
There could be, and I'm not willing to speculate on that. I haven't looked into that area. To my own satisfaction to speculate, and
this is more important, to be fair.
And I don't like to I mean, when it comes to weirdness, the Franklin scandal is way up there. So
Right.
I mean, at this point, whatever the government did, no matter how weird it is, I wouldn't automatically dismiss it.
Right.
I would be agnostic at best, and then
Yeah.
so I've got to look into this. But because after spending 12 years in this swimming in that sewer, anything that the government does, and uncovering a lot of other malfeasance, anything that the government does would not surprise me.
Yeah.
So anything that very wealthy, powerful people do would not surprise me.
Yeah.
So it's just one has to be cautious.
No, sure.
And look at the sources, and because some of the things on the internet go pretty far, and they can be specious, and sometimes where there's smoke, there's fire.
And do you feel like the researcher, though, it is kind of your responsibility to kind of keep yourself, like a better word, pure, so that you can't be just easily dismissed by, more quote-unquote credible people?
Well, I mean, I would love it for someone to debate me about the Franklin scandal.
Yeah.
I would love that.
Right.
I mean, I had one guy try to do it in Omaha.
Right.
And it didn't work out so well for him. So, but I would love someone in the mainstream media to debate me on the Franklin scandal.
Right. What's the likelihood of you walking on a Rachel Maddow side? Zero.
Probably zero probability.
Yeah.
Same with Sean Hannity.
Right.
Probably zero probability there, too.
Yeah.
And, it's kind of interesting because there have been some people that are very high up in the media that I know that have read the Franklin scandal.
Really?
And, but there's such a reluctance to make it, to publicize it. It's.
Are you working on a new book? Are you working on any projects coming up? Is there anything that you're...
I'm working on a documentary on something completely different, and then I'm trying to get the Franklin scandal made into a docuseries.
Well, that we hope and pray happens.
Yes, and I'm actually been kind of stunned. This team that has come together around the Franklin scandal is, it's a first-rate team.
It is. Yeah, and I know some of those people. They're great.
And as soon as I thought that this team came together, I thought that it was, that it would be easy to finally get this into a docuseries form. And I'm a little stunned that the media continues to be so spineless.
Yeah.
Especially regarding the molestation of children. I mean, and the thing is, okay, so the Catholic Church, that's out now.
Yeah.
The Catholic Church colluded, trafficked, covered up the abuse of children. Now, the next step in our societal understanding of child trafficking is that the government participates in that, or facets of the government.
One thing I wanted to ask you before,
and that is, and we have to, get that into public consciousness.
Yeah.
And until that happens, we're going to be missing a huge.
How high up do you think it was? Do you think we're talking vice presidents and presidents, or no? You think we're talking directors of national CIA? We're talking.
Well, okay, so we've got the FBI and the Department of Justice covering up a pedophile network, an interstate pedophile network. Now, you've got like the Attorney General.
Yeah.
I mean, the Attorney General would most likely know if his subordinates were covering up an interstate pedophile network that pandered children to rich and powerful people and that deployed blackmail and that had connections with the CIA. You would think that an Attorney General would know that. I mean, who's going to take the fall for that?
I mean, did your research show? Sorry.
So, I mean, but would an Attorney General take a fall for it? I mean, would it go up higher? I mean, one would think that it probably does. I mean, that people all the way to the top would have known about this.
Yeah. Now, just to be not quite devil's advocate, but be skeptical about it. Does your research the idea is there's pockets of these guys within the organizations that aren't necessarily? It's not like they're part of a top-down hierarchy of abducting these kids. Have you looked into that idea? Like I personally don't think it's true, but do you look into that? It's not necessarily that it's an administration, like the FBI is doing it, as an organization, but that you have some, rogue guys who might be part of a deeper network of individuals who happen to be.
Or is
FBI
it just?
guys.
I think you answered it before, but you can answer it again. Whereas I think you were talking about people are willing to do the MK Ultra, these experiments, people that work for these agencies seem to be willing to.
No, sure, but I was more getting that. Do you think it's to the idea that it's possible that the director might not know?
Well, here's the situation. With Franklin, you've got 2 U.S. attorneys covering up this pedophile network. You've got a U.S. attorney in Nebraska. You've got a U.S. attorney in Washington D.C. You've got a U.S. district court judge in Nebraska that's helping cover it up. You've got a U.S. magistrate in Nebraska that's helping cover it up. So you've got a number of people on the upper echelon, and then you've got FBI agents in Nebraska, and then you've got secrets.
This isn't a rogue group.
And then you've got secrets.
Fair point. Sorry about that. Sorry, bad question.
And then you've got Secret Service agents in Washington D.C. that are helping cover it up. We're talking, a number of people. So someone, if this was going to come out, who was going to take the fall?
Right. How many victims have contacted you personally? A lot of victims?
A number of them.
A number of them have contacted you where you talk to these people. Have any of them been able, I know Alicia has, have any of them been able to, and I think Paul Benassi has, but have these people been able to kind of rebuild their lives, or are their lives just permanently shattered by it?
Some of them have.
Yeah.
Some of them haven't. And this is the really, gut-wrenching, heartbreaking side of this story is when you get these kids, they're generally from dysfunctional backgrounds. Like a number of them were taken out of Boys Town, a number of them were taken out of other institutions, a number of them were taken out of the foster care system. And then they're pandered. And then they're turned on to drugs. I mean, that is the carrot for them, drugs and money.
Right.
And so they reach a certain point where they lose their marketability, and then they're expunged, and they have no skills, they have no self-esteem, and they're drug addicts, and they go on to commit felonies and end up in prison, or else they die.
And many of them are compromised in sexual assault
and unnatural.
Well.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
is there any evidence of that? Because there's a documentary on Netflix called Pervert Park, where it's like you'll have parents abusing children, and those children grow up, and then they abuse people. Do you think that this is transferred at all? Have you ever looked at the science of that?
Well, there's one of the kids that's in the book that was trafficked by Lawrence King that went on to be busted for child pornography. And I've gotten to know him very well. I mean, now here's a kid that was his mother was schizophrenic. He never knew his father.
Right.
He was getting molested in foster care homes when he was 5 and 6 years old.
Yeah.
And beaten regularly, and then he was put in Boys Town when he was very, very young, and King started to fly him around and pander him.
Yeah.
I mean, and turn him on to drugs. I mean, how is a kid like this
Supposed to develop.
I mean,
Especially that young age of brain development.
I mean, how can they not be, and this kid, I mean, he's been out of prison for a while, and I keep in touch with him, and he's kept his nose clean.
Yeah.
And
Why is a guy like Lawrence E. King,
Go straight on.
he's still alive, there's been no mysterious accident, nothing like that. Why would you keep a guy like that alive, a guy who's so, such a risk if he were to speak, the things he knows?
Well, when this started going down, Lawrence King was put in a mental institution in Springfield State, without a motion from his attorney or any attorney.
Right.
Representing, and he actually George Herbert Walker Bush was having a fundraiser when 2 Secret Servicemen picked up Lawrence King, brought him in front of a magistrate, and the magistrate said he's crazy and you got to take him to Springfield to get him psychiatrically evaluated. The magistrate is now a U.S. Court judge, by the way. So, and I think this is my surmise, but I think it's a relatively reasonable surmise. I think Lawrence King was told, Larry, you've done some good work for us, and you're going to have to do some time. As long as you don't talk, we'll take care of you. And he basically has a no-show job,
Right.
at a car dealership in Virginia.
Have you reached out to him to speak to him?
Well, I tried to talk to him once, but he said he wasn't him. So,
Right.
Communication between him and I has been kind of difficult because of that.
Right.
But he's doing good now. Craig Spence, his pedophilic pandering partner, he was a coke addict, and he was a loose cannon, and he died a very mysterious death.
Yeah.
And I think that Spence, given his cocaine addiction and just his loose cannon nature, had become a major liability. Whereas King has kept his mouth shut throughout all this legal travails,
Right.
and done his time.
Right. Would you contact a guy like Aquino, or is it not worth it? I mean, he's very accessible. He writes all the time. He denies everything. And does it make sense for you to contact him and try to get an on-the-record statement from him, or no?
Well, I mean, Michael Aquino and I have yet to talk, but you never know.
Interesting.
What's going to happen?
Yeah, interesting. All right, well, we'll leave it there. I mean, that's interesting. What is the website where they can get this book?
FranklinScandal.com.
FranklinScandal.com. Go order this book. This is something you have to read. Go on Netflix and the documentary Who to China, which I'm sure you've seen. And
I'm in it. Yeah,
you're in it?
I'm interviewed, yeah.
Go watch it. Definitely, I would say I read this book. I read it in 2 days, and I reread it. It is essential to read if you really want to know about this, because there's nowhere else to get this information. And sometimes we say that, and we're kind of being dramatic, but here there's nowhere else to get this information. You're not going to get this on a website. You're not going to get it on a chat room and a message board. Get the Franklin Scandal, go out, buy it, read it, and then give it to somebody. Give it to somebody who you argue with politically. Give it to somebody who's skeptical about this. Give it to somebody who puts their hand in your face and goes, "Oh, get out of here," because this is impossible to ignore.
That's the thing. It's unlike a lot of these, you put people on a website. This is like real journalism.
Yeah.
It's researched.
And it reads like a novel. It's a great book.
People want to dismiss it, but if they actually do read it, I challenge them to.
It's basically a true crime.
Yeah.
Right.
Book.
Right.
That's what it is.
Yeah, I mean, that's what it is. But listen, I appreciate you coming on, Nick, and
Thanks,
hopefully
Tim.
that one day you can work
And
on
then
something a
exit
little
left.
lighter. I mean, this has been a journey for you.
Yeah, I think once there was a way to get back home, but
Right.
I think I've been down this road for so far. That
What a great way to put it. Once there was a way to get back home, but no longer.
Yes.
I fear for us it's probably the same thing.
We're pretty close to the end.
Yeah, all right. Thank you so much.
okay, thank you, Tim.